You pay attention with so much at stake.
Seas are rising and chronic flooding will be the new normal.
You navigate, you listen, you keep an ear out. You pay attention, and so do we. We tell the stories of our time every day.
In the 26th day of testimony and on the 139th witness, Shahar Tsarnaev wept.
We unearth what would otherwise stay hidden.
There's just a lot of hate in this world, and that day, for that hour, we were humans.
Across the street.
The Red Sox have won the World Series.
And around the globe.
It's here and now.
This is modern love.
This is WBUR's All Things Considered.
This is only a game.
This is On Point.
This is Radio Boston.
On air, online, on demand, and on stage in the heart of Boston.
I'm Jack Lepiars. Welcome to WBUR City Space.
Always looking forward, paying attention, and knowing that your story is one of our stories.
Good morning. I'm Bob Epps.
I'm Lisa Mullins.
I'm Meghna Chakrabarti.
I'm Jeremy Hobson.
This is 90.9 WBUR Boston.
Good evening, everybody. Hi, we're a small enough group. We can say good evening, right? First of all, I want to commend you for mostly moving into the center. Thank you for following instructions. They have a big event tomorrow morning, and it's set up for that. So we're grateful to WBUR for being our partner on this and allowing us to use this absolutely stunning space. My name's Jessie Mermel from the Alliance for Business Leadership, and I want to thank you all for being here for what is an incredibly important conversation about the intersection of housing and our economy. At the Alliance for Business Leadership, we're a coalition of progressive business leaders who have this crazy idea that social responsibility and sustainable economic growth go hand in hand, and we try to do what we can to use our power and platform as business leaders to move the needle on economic inequality and social mobility. And few things impact those things like access to quality, affordable housing. And I think for all of us in the room, we are seeing increasingly from a workforce perspective that it is becoming an greater challenge every single day for businesses to attract and retain top talent to this region, whether you're paying hourly workers or you're paying six-figure salaries. The housing crisis here is making the talent game even tougher than it already was. And we're incredibly excited to have this important conversation with some real experts in this field, both people from the policy space and the business space, state level and city level, to figure out A, what's going on, and perhaps more importantly, B, how can all of us in this room help. I thanked WBUR. I also want to thank my colleagues, Carolee Moore and Megan Green, who are here. I see Megan. Carolee might be still out at the table, who helped make all of this happen. So as always, incredibly grateful for their work. We are really hoping to have an interactive conversation this evening. And so you saw on the tables when you walked in, and there was an email ahead of time, and hopefully it's going to come up here. But if you go to slido.com, that's S as in Sam, L-I-D as in dog, O.com. Yep, right there. You don't need to download anything. It's incredibly simple. Just enter that hashtag and that code, hashtag HC924, and you'll be able to tell us a story or ask a question. Let us know how housing has impacted you personally, has impacted your businesses, has impacted your employees, and then we'll have an opportunity to share those questions with the panel and have a real interactive conversation. I don't know about you. I don't enjoy being talked at for a few hours. I'd much rather have a back and forth. And that's certainly what we intend to do tonight. Now I'd like to bring up David Gasson. He's from Boston Capital, our lead sponsor this evening. We're incredibly grateful for their generosity in making tonight happen. He's also a member of WBUR's Executive Advisory Council, and he's going to get us kicked off tonight.
This is an audit for me because I will be the night's briefest speaker. I'm thrilled to be here because this is something I've wanted to do for a long time, as Jesse and Amy McDonald, who runs this amazing space, know, in the context of getting a conversation going on housing. And I'm also the proudest person here because, as Jesse said, I do work at Boston Capital, and we're the lead sponsor of the event. I am on now, Jesse, what is now the Community Advisory Board. They changed our name. We're no longer the EAC, we're the CAB, the Community Advisory Board, on which I got to serve with Tiziana before she became talent here at BUR. And then I'm also on the board of the Alliance for Business Leadership. So I get to wear three hats tonight, which makes me that much more proud, and I'm really thrilled to be here. At Boston Capital, we've been working on affordable housing for over 40 years. I've been doing it myself there for over 25. And issues we're going to discuss tonight have been at the heart of what we work on a day-to-day basis. I have a number of colleagues here, which I really appreciate. And I have a number of partners here. Sheila with D&D, Department of Neighborhood Development. Roger at POA is one of our development partners that we work with all the time. And so we're thrilled in that regard. At WBUR, we've been working on housing issues through Bostonomics and through Edify and highlighting the needs of affordable housing as well as economic development issues around Boston and the greater area, so it's a priority there. And at the Alliance for Business Leadership, it's been one of our marquee issues for the past 5 to 7 years, working on how we develop more affordable housing, more workforce housing, and why it's important for the development of the Boston area as we continue to expand. We can't be successful if we can't house the people that are making that success possible. And I'm doubly thrilled because I got to meet Secretary Keneally through a mutual friend of ours, Chris Collins. And if you talk to Chris before you meet the secretary, you think you're about to meet Moses, Jesus combined or something like that. The man's amazing. And I admire him so much for this reason, is that this is someone who became incredibly successful in the private sector and could have remained there. He could have stayed and just continue to be successful, add to the community, add to his local community, and just accumulate what he's done so much for. And instead, he decided he's going to give back. He's going to give back to the community. He's going to serve on local boards. He's going to help fix school systems. And then we were fortunate enough to have Governor Baker draft him into the administration. And now he's Secretary of Housing and Economic Development, where a lot of folks in the room, we get to partner with him and the folks at his agency to, again, expand the possibilities here in the Boston area. So I'm extremely thrilled to introduce and hear some remarks from the Secretary of Housing and Economic Development, Mike Keneally.
That is a tough introduction to follow. Good Lord, literally, I guess. That's a tough introduction to follow. Everybody, thank you so much. It's great to be with you today. I want to thank WBUR and thank the Alliance for Business Leadership for bringing us together to talk about this vitally important topic. We have a housing crisis across the state. And in public life, or really in any area of life, we shouldn't throw around the word crisis. But this is, in fact, a crisis. We have a housing market that for a long time now has failed to keep pace with the vitality of our economy, the aspirations of our communities, or the needs of our citizens. You know, for us, this, in our view, this is a production-driven crisis. So let's start with some numbers. From 1960 to 1990, the state produced 900,000 units of new housing. That's a pretty good number. From 1990 till today, a similar 30-year period, we've produced 435,000. So in a single generation, we've cut in half our level of housing production at a time when our economy's grown and our population has grown. Now, sitting here today in Massachusetts in 2019, we are the economic envy of the world, one of the world's leading innovation economies. We have unemployment below 3%. We're number one in life sciences. We have the best colleges and universities anywhere in the world. We have fantastic research institutes. We have companies big and small that are global leaders in what they do. But I'll tell you what, it's all at risk if we can't solve our housing crisis. Since 2010, for example, we've added 300,000 citizens, 400,000 jobs, and less than 100,000 housing units. So what do we have, folks? We have an imbalance between supply and demand. Demand has grown, supply has gone off a cliff. So what happens then? Prices go up. If you look at vacancy rates for home ownership and rental properties, they're about half what they ought to be. You know, economists say that home ownership vacancy rate should be about 6%. We're at about 3% today in Massachusetts. Rental properties, sorry, that's a rental property, 6% and 3%. For home ownership, it should be 2%. We're about 0.8%. So very, very tight housing market. Since the year 2000, home values have gone up 75%. Rents have gone up 75%. Now, I've been here almost my entire life, and I always thought, for all of our strong attributes, I always thought we were sort of a high-cost place. So I was surprised to learn that in 1980, we were about the national average in terms of home values. But since that time, we've grown faster than any other state in the country, and today we're number 3, behind California and Hawaii. Our rent for a 2-bedroom apartment is number 1. Now, we love to be number 1 around here in everything, right? Economy, sports, everything. We don't want to be number 1 in rent. And so the consequence is this has real impact in our communities. Now, I've been secretary for about 9 months. I've been to, 95 cities and towns. I'd spent a lot of time on the road talking to mayors, talking to business leaders, talking to community groups, They all say the housing crisis has a dramatic impact on their communities. It has a dramatic impact on households. So sitting here today in Massachusetts, about half of our households pay more than 30% of their income in housing. They are deemed to be cost burdened by housing. That number, by the way, in the year 2000 was about 30%. So many more of our households are cost burdened. And there's actually kind of a shocking number of families that spend about half their income on housing. So big impact on communities, big impact on our people, and a big impact on our ability to compete economically. So I became secretary 9 months ago. I spent the first term as an assistant secretary focused on business development. So typically these sort of large-scale projects, we're competing for jobs, okay? And we compete against Atlanta and Austin and Portland and Seattle and Denver and lots of places, okay? If you look at how much, so I already told you we're a lot more expensive than those places. If you look at how much housing those places produce, it's way more than we produce. So in Greater Boston, we produce about 2 to 3 units of new housing per 1,000 residents. Austin produces 11. So we have real competitiveness problems against some metro areas that albeit, I don't think are as strong as us, but they have their own attributes. And increasingly, they are less expensive than us and getting more so. Now, one thing I like to emphasize is that as an administration, we're doing a lot to combat this crisis. And so last year, the governor signed a $1.8 billion housing bond bill, the biggest housing bill in the history of the state. We've invested $1.1 billion to create 17,000 housing units, 15,000 of which are affordable, about 3,000 of which are affordable for folks with extremely low incomes. We have this program called MassWorks. We invest public infrastructure dollars. We invest public money to create infrastructure to facilitate private development. That's generated about 11,000 units. Our Mass Housing Workforce Housing Fund, about 3,000 units. And we just committed another $86 million to that fund to create workforce home ownership opportunities. We have a program called the State's Open for Business program, where we try to develop state-owned land. That's created about 2,000. Reforms to our housing development incentive program have created 1,000 units in gateway cities. You know, I could go on and on. I think I just did. But we've done a lot to try to combat the housing crisis. And by the way, you know, there's a lot we should be proud of in housing in Massachusetts. We're the only state in the country where homeless families have a right to shelter. We have by far the largest state-owned public housing system, and we've invested about $800 million in that. We also have increased by 50% our rental voucher program to make housing more affordable for folks who need it. So we as government have done a lot, and will continue to do a lot at record levels, but it's simply not going to be enough. We cannot subsidize and spend our way out of this problem. What we need to do is empower cities and towns with the tools they need to develop the housing they need for their communities. And this is where the governor's housing choice legislation comes in. Now, since 1920 in Massachusetts, state law has said that any rezoning of a property for any reason requires a 2/3 vote of the local legislative body, be that town meeting or city council. What we propose to do in the governor's legislation is for a handful of housing best practices to lower that threshold from a supermajority to a simple majority. And we think that will unlock housing production all across the state. And so these are best practices like accessory dwelling units and these smart growth developments where you create more density in downtowns and near public transit. They're really good developments we think will unlock housing production across the state. Importantly, the bill does not provide a mandate for cities and towns. What it does is simply provide an easier path for them to develop the housing that works for them. And I always say, you know, the housing choice legislation will not solve everything, but it will help everything. We view it as just sort of truly foundational. We get this done, we create an easier path for cities and towns to develop housing, we'll see a lot more housing. And by the way, I hope sitting here, and what I just told you is one of the world-leading innovation economies, I hope we can agree that maybe the world's a bit different than it was in 1920. Maybe we should make a simple common sense reform and get it done. And a lot of folks have signed on to this. So if you look at, for example, the AARP endorsed our legislation because they view this as an issue for seniors. Seniors need different types of housing. They want to stay in their communities, and the communities want to provide more housing for their seniors. A variety of chambers of commerce across the state have endorsed it. Greater Boston Chamber, Cape Cod Chamber, Worcester Chamber, South Shore Chamber, many others, because they view this as a business talent attraction and retention issue. Companies need to attract talent and retain talent, and high housing prices gets in the way of that. The MMA has endorsed the bill, 35-0. The Metro mayors have endorsed it. MAPC, Smart Growth Alliance, CHAPA, many other groups, NIOP, the home builders, groups that frankly don't always agree, have come together to say we need to get this bill passed. So we are in a crisis and we have to address it. And this is really, I'll tell you, you get into public policy, you can focus on the statutes and the facts and the data. At the end of the day, it's values. It's our future. It's who do we want to be, what kind of communities we want to create. So that's the crisis side of it. That's what we're trying to get done. I do want to close with sort of a note of optimism and tell you a little bit about how I spent part of my summer. So we decided we'd go on the road and tour affordable housing developments all across the state. And I spent 8 days on the road in 17 cities and towns and toured 25 different developments. And when you understand what it takes to create affordable housing in Massachusetts, it's this incredible level of just collaboration and ingenuity and frankly tenacity to get it done. You see these amazing developments that are true community treasures involving the collaboration of local players, state players, developers, community groups, others. You see this stuff and you understand the impact on people and communities and what more housing can accomplish for our future. So that's my note of optimism. We know we can come together and solve problems and capitalize on opportunities, and the housing choice legislation will let us do that. Thanks for your time tonight. Great to be with you.
Thank you so much, Secretary. You know, we made the title of tonight's event, I'm Taking the Job in Charlotte, How the High Cost of Housing is Hurting Massachusetts Businesses, for the exact reason that the Secretary mentioned, that it is getting harder for businesses to attract and retain talent here in Massachusetts. And it makes me so happy to know that we have this incredible mix of folks in the room right now, right? We have folks from BNI Mellon, and we have folks from Cambridge Naturals and JP Licks and every size or industry of business in between. And I think it just shows you that the Secretary is right. This is affecting every business in every corner of Massachusetts, regardless of size and sector. And we now have the opportunity to hear from a really fantastic panel moderated by Tiziana Dearing, who is going to lead us in a discussion that I think she is uniquely equipped to guide us through. Before she became the host of Radio Boston on WBUR, she was a commentator and a contributor for more than a decade and is a longtime anti-poverty advocate. So she truly understands the intersection of what we're talking about here, right? Housing and opportunity. And unfortunately, in some instances, poverty. She is going to be joined by Undersecretary of Housing and Community Development Janelle Chan, Roger Brown, the Managing Director of Real Estate for Preservation of Affordable Housing, Sheila Dillon, Chief of Housing and Director of Neighborhood Development for the City of Boston, and Amy Sprung, Director of Technology and Civic Engagement for Microsoft New England. And now this shows you how much faith my staff has in me. They actually wrote on here, clap. So...
How are you? Excellent. Love those answers. So the team at the Alliance has been incredibly professional and polished and organized, and I plan to take us down like 7 notches to a much more casual conversation, because I think if we can do that, it's going to allow us to invite you to be interactive in a different way. So I am Tiziana Dearing. I'm your moderator for tonight. We have a lot of time for good content. Let me just give you a little sense of what to expect. In a minute, I'm going to turn to our panelists and invite each of them to make opening comments. I think we'll just start at Roger and work our way down. Don't worry, I gave them an assignment in advance for what those opening statements should focus on. Once those opening statements are done, we'll do a little Q&A among us to kind of get the conversation warmed up. We're going to do some storytelling, and I'll walk you through how we're going to do that when the time comes. And then we're going to leave plenty of time for audience Q&A using Slido with you in the audience. Before we start, I think it's always helpful when we do any kind of panel or moderation to understand what the learning agenda of the people in the room is, because it often allows us to be of better service in the conversation that we're having. So first, I'm just going to ask for a show of hands. How many of you are here because this is a subject you're coming to learn more about? Show of hands. But panelists, can you see out there? We've got bright lights, but I think we can see. Thanks. The waving is actually excellent because we're like T-Rexes. We can see movement. So that's very helpful. How many of you are here because you're an activist or expert in this area and you're just getting your geek on by being here? All right. We got a lot of geeks in the audience tonight, too. That's awesome. How many of you are here for some other purpose that isn't those two? All right. So very quickly, before we begin, could we just get a quick shout out from you? What would you like to hear about or learn tonight? Just give us a shout out on a few things. What are you hoping to hear about and learn tonight?
Your perspective.
Okay, perspectives, great. What else?
Cost of production.
Cost of production, what else?
Airbnb.
Airbnb and the role it plays in the economy around housing, great. What else? Zoning.
Earnings a person makes to be entitled to affordable housing.
Okay, so affordable housing thresholds and earnings thresholds. Anybody else want to put out something for the learning agenda for tonight? Solutions. Anything else?
Business leaders.
Transportation.
Business leaders' involvement.
How business leaders can be involved in solving the problem. Anybody else?
How to mobilize the community and support it.
How do we mobilize to support? Okay, that feels like kind of in the wheelhouse of the things we were preparing to talk about, but hopefully that's helpful to you too, and kind of knowing what people are here to listen for tonight. All right, so I think without any further ado, I'm going to turn to Roger Brown, Managing Director of Real Estate Development for Preservation of Affordable Housing. Actually, let me backtrack. There's one other thing that I would like to ask of the panelists, to the point of one of the audience members. Can we be clear when we are discussing the term affordable housing and what we mean is, so I'm saying in your comments, and what we mean is just the general colloquial term housing affordability versus when you're saying affordable housing and what you mean is the technical term affordable housing, which is, for example, defined by percentage of area median income, just so that we're really clear which thing we're talking about when we go through our terms. All good? Okay, I'm going to give you about 3 minutes, and I'm going to give you a little wave when I'd like you to stop. And we're going to go from there. So, Roger, let me turn it over to you.
Fair enough. Thanks for being here tonight. I'm going to speak from the perspective of someone who's involved in the production and preservation of affordable housing. We work in Boston and a number of other cities, so there's some commonalities that we see across markets, but are things that are accentuated in Boston that are unique to Boston. We had a little homework assignment. I'm going to look at my crib sheet here. The first thing I was supposed to talk about was how, I defined the problem. And so there are three things that I think about in terms of the high cost of housing in Boston and how it affects businesses. From my perspective, the number one thing is the high production cost. It really limits our ability to generate the unit counts that we need to generate. If we're going to build from scratch in Boston, I'll compare it to Washington, D.C., where we also do some large programs. We're about a 30% premium to build in Boston over Washington, D.C., which is itself a high-cost market. We also know, we have tight budgets, as the Secretary will know. So in some other geographies, municipalities have a lot of money to spend on housing. We do our fair share in Boston, but with a combination of high cost, we have limited public resources. My partners here on stage are sick of looking at me as I come to get projects funded, but it's very expensive, and we're trying to leverage as much of that as possible, but it makes it very hard to do. And lastly, defining what we're trying to do, a lot of times our projects have multiple objectives we're trying to do. We're trying to house the poorest families. We're trying to be sustainable. We're trying to generate jobs in the communities where we work in. And so there's a whole layer of regulatory framework that we operate in that we're doing good things, but the net result of some of that is that it's increasing our costs. We're not operating out of the trunk of the car. The second part of that was, key drivers of the problem as we see it. We talked about cost before. There are two things that are going on in our world. We like to acquire existing assets and hold them to be affordable assets for the long term. In this capital market, everybody looked at their interest rate that they're getting in the bank now, it's less than 1%. There's a lot of capital running around looking for return. That really drives up the cost of assets. I think we're kind of in a housing asset bubble as investors, hedge funds, private money goes out and buys up resources that might otherwise be deployed as affordable housing. We have also seen, since the last recession, what we feel like is a real reduction in the labor force that's available to actually do construction work. And so that limited supply has driven up the cost for our subcontractors and general contractors. We talked a little bit about the regulatory framework. In my other life, I actually sit on one of those zoning boards in a small town outside of Boston. I'm not gonna say. But as we try to solve the problem locally, there's a huge resistance to increasing density. Like you can't build multifamily by right in the town I'm in. Everything is a special permit. And everything that's a special permit comes to the ZBA or town meeting. Goes back to the secretary's point, and that really constrains our ability to produce. And from my perspective, I know it's a little different inside of 128 and what the mayor's doing in Boston. Regional cooperation is really lacking. I mean, you work in some other parts of the country, the counties are really large. There's not 351 cities and towns. That kind of regional cooperation can get us to a place where we can do planning and actually get density built. Shall I go on to my third one? We're out of town.
You're killing it, so you go ahead.
Okay. So a couple of ideas to address the problem, some of which we're doing. We're using new technology. I just had a team from our company and one of our partners come back from a week trip to the Netherlands, where we're exploring a partnership with a modular construction company, use the technology that they have in Europe to bring it to Somerville, to a project that we're doing with the state. And I think that's going to be fairly successful. And we're hoping that we're going to... Okay, we'll be successful. You've heard it.
No hedging allowed.
No hedging allowed. And we think we're going to drive the cost of construction down. We were also lucky enough there to find a private company that's managing money that was in search of a project that had a social return. So they were able to invest their equity at a below market rate. That's also helping us to do that. We also think we'd probably be good to re-examine our regulatory framework to see if we can have some more flexibility to get maybe do a slightly different product. Maybe we do smaller units. I was in Washington, D.C. last week at an Urban Land Institute conference, and we did a tour of a project that was purpose-built co-living from scratch in downtown D.C. It worked fairly well. It was for young people coming out of college, something that they might otherwise cram 9 kids into a three-decker. In this case, it's within their regulatory framework, new production, and people seem to have it, accepted into the marketplace. And lastly, we're doing some work on transit-oriented development sites in the city, in Roxbury and in Mattapan, and our ability to increase density on public land was key to be able to make those projects feasible and get some really good unit counts in places where ready access to transportation will allow our people who live in the affordable housing to be able to get to work without having to clog the roads and without hopefully having to have the losing investment of buying a car and having it sit in the garage and depreciate 95% of the time. So.
Excellent. Thank you, Roger. That's great. I'm going to go straight to Sheila. Sheila Dearing, Chief of Housing and Director of Neighborhood Development, the City of Boston. Sheila, I'll turn it over to you.
Sure. Well, thank you. Thank you for having me tonight. And I'm going to really, I think, reinforce a lot of what I heard from Secretary Keneally. So Boston is in this. I've lived in this city now for 3 decades, and it is. I've never seen the population and the job growth like we're experiencing right now. And it's not unique to Boston. Most major coastal cities are seeing, people moving into the city to chase a very, very hot economies and a lot of jobs. And it's putting enormous amounts of pressure. I don't have to tell you, you know this. But it's just amazing. We have, in the last 5 years in the Walsh administration, 120,000 new jobs have been created in Boston. It's a staggering number. And we came out with a housing plan saying we got to increase supply across all income groups, and we can talk about that. And within, in 2 years in, we said, oh boy, population's growing faster than we had thought, and we had to increase our production goals. Now we feel like we need 69,000 new units of housing by the year 2030. And so there's a lot of challenges to this, because while we really want this housing to be available to a range of incomes, and if it was a different group, we would be debating exactly what AMI and exactly what, so we do have targets. We really do want to build a lot of housing for folks that are, at the lower edge of the pay scale, the wage scale. And we want to build middle income housing, and we want market rate housing to free up a lot of the older stock. So we really do want a range of incomes. What the frustration is, I think we want to build more affordable housing than we actually can. State resources are limited. The city's trying to extract more and more from developers, but we don't have a federal partner as much as we used to. So that's a really big challenge for us. We want to build more housing. We want a lot of that to be deeply affordable, but we don't have the federal partner like we used to. We used to get about 70% of our housing resources from the federal government. We now get in the high 20%. So it's 26 or 27%. So we really do need the next administration. We all need to be united, and we need to get more federal resources. So that's a big challenge, having enough money. A couple of other challenges. Boston's 44 square miles. So we don't have a lot. We can go up, and we are going up more than we ever have, and a lot of people don't like it. But we don't have a lot of empty cornfields. We don't have a lot of places to expand. So we really do need to continue to find good locations and make land available. But this gets to, I think, Secretary Keneally's point and mine. We need a regional response. So we're taking a lot of heat for building a lot of housing. It is not fun to go out every night and try to push a mixed income housing or affordable housing in every neighborhood. But we really do need the region to open up and build more housing and take the pressure off Boston. We're going to own what we own, and we're going to stick with it, and we're going to live to fight another day. But we really do need the region to step up. So that money and the region is key, and transportation. I'm hopeful. I'm reading in the paper, but new investments are being made in RT and our commuter rails. That too will help Boston as we don't want people to leave that want to stay here, but people that have good transportation, they can get into the city and out of the city easily, is certainly going to help us grow our economy. So we need resources, we need land, we need the region, and we need good transit.
That was fabulous. Thank you. I appreciate it. And the two of you have already given me like 30 questions I want to ask before we even get to the audience. Okay, so Amy Sprung, Director, Technology and Civic Engagement of Microsoft. I'm going to turn it straight to you.
Awesome. Thanks. So I'm going to share a little bit of a story about how I think the business community can engage and how Microsoft is engaging in Seattle in particular. So bear with me while I take us outside of Boston for a second. Microsoft is headquartered in Seattle. We have well over 50,000 employees in Seattle. And I think that there are a lot of commonalities between the issues that we're raising here in Boston, the issues that I see in Seattle as well. Certainly, they have a booming innovation economy with headquarters for Microsoft and Amazon in Seattle, as well as companies like Boeing and Starbucks there. There's a huge startup community there, and they are also experiencing incredible cost and housing growth. Since 2011, jobs in the region have grown 21%, but growth in housing construction has lagged at 13%. So very similar story. The gap in available housing has caused housing prices to surge 96% in the past 8 years. So it's a crazy situation, but a lot, again, very similar to some of the numbers, the crazy numbers that we're talking about here. And there's, of course, as a result, a large gap in affordable and workforce housing. So in the spring, Microsoft made a commitment to really engage in this challenge in Seattle. And ultimately, the main priority is around promoting a healthy community. In order to have a healthy business, we really have to have a healthy community. And the main focus that I hear from my colleagues who are focused on this effort is really around how do we make sure that the teachers and the firemen in the community, that the arts organizations and the nonprofits also have a place to live in the communities where a lot of our employees are living. And so specifically how we're doing this, Microsoft committed $500 million as a company to advance affordable housing solutions. It's divided into 3 different buckets. One bucket that's focused on lower than market rate returns $225 million at lower than market rate returns to inject capital to subsidize the preservation and construction of middle income housing. Another chunk of money to support low-income housing across the entire King County region. And then the last bucket is philanthropic dollars focused on fighting homelessness issues that they're facing in Seattle that are pretty challenging for them as well. So I can share more details for sure about some of the challenges that we as an employer here in Boston are facing, but wanted to sort of set the tone of, that was, I think, some of the original reason why Megan invited me to participate tonight. So thanks.
Thanks, Amy. I appreciate it. And last but not least, Undersecretary Janelle Chan, Department of Housing and Community Development, Commonwealth of Massachusetts.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. And these two folks here are part of my comrades in terms of trying to build affordable housing. And Amy, I'm so delighted for you to be on the panel here together, and definitely to get small business and large business involved in what we see as a key issue, which is housing production. Secretary Keneally definitely gave us food for thought in terms of his opening remarks. I want to take it down to a different level, a more granular level in talking about homes. My background is in community development, and so let's talk about from homes. I feel like that life cycle of a home is really broken at the moment. And what do I mean by that? So when we go out to the suburbs, there are empty nesters who tell us, listen, I don't want to mow my lawn anymore. I don't want to shovel snow anymore. I understand that I'm not empty nester, but let's just say, and they want to downsize, right? They want to move into a 1-bedroom condo or a 2-bedroom condo. But guess what? It doesn't exist in their community. Nobody is building that. And it's not because there's no demand for it. And if it does exist, it's out of their budget, right? So we have that problem. What does that actually mean for everyone else, including myself? Right? It means folks who are graduating from all of our lovely local universities, all great universities around here, can't stay in Massachusetts, right? It means that young families and normal families, regular families, can't put down roots and continue to build this economy. So, and they can't get into those single families that the empty nesters are trying to get out of. And so that's on a person level, what our statistics about production actually really means. Now I'm going to take it up to the local community level and really at the city. When I'm out there on our affordable housing tour, or when I'm going to visit different cities and towns, oftentimes what I hear from cities and towns is their aspirations. Just great. They look at inner core cities like Somerville, which was recently named by CNN as one of the best places to live in the U.S. And besides being close to Boston, where a lot of the jobs are, I have to say, why is Somerville so attractive to so many people? It's because it's dense. Right? That vibrancy you are feeling when you're on the street, the fact that you're able to walk to not just your cafes, to your juices or your green juices, whatnot. It's also because you can walk to services. You can walk to your local nonprofits. You can walk to healthcare and all the other amenities, right? Not just the luxury amenities, but amenities that you need in your life. You can get to those places. And that's because of density, right? Not to mention that they have a Green Line extension going through. And so what I have to say is that when we're out in these cities and towns, we're trying to figure out right now, how do we encourage more smart growth? How do we encourage walkable cities near transit? Governor Baker and Secretary Pollack recently released the congestion report, and in it, it specifically recommends that we build more affordable housing near transit. I know that we have a lot of tools at our disposal in Massachusetts. We are a leader in many fronts, and we have a lot of our quasi partners. We have TA assistance. We also have what we call 40R, which is part of zoning. That's an overlay district that increases density. But I'm going to give you a statistic that we're trying to delve into right now. We have about 23,000 units permitted via our 40R overlay district that allows for increased density. Only about 3,000 units have actually been produced, right? Why is that? That's what we're trying to solve, right? Why is it? And I think part of it is, from my own experience, I like to get onto the ground. I've been to town hall meetings. I've seen projects that we're supportive of, just die in town hall meetings, even if we're supporting it, right? I've been to town hall meeting. I'm not going to name which community. I stayed there till midnight 3 days in a row to try to see a project go forward, and it died on the vine, right? And part of that is because many reasons. But one of the reasons I noticed is there's a new 4-letter word out there. It's KIDS. And that tells you that there is actually a disconnect between perception and actuality. MAPC released a report that says up to 2040, the population is going to increase, I think about 13%. But actually, school enrollment is going to be down by 8%. 70% of communities actually have a decreasing school enrollment. So again, there's a lot of conversations that we need to have on a local level, and that's how we can all get involved in doing that.
Thanks, Janelle. Okay, so for the next few minutes, I'm just going to ask our panelists a couple of questions, and then we're going to shift gears in a few minutes. Janelle, I know you have to go at 7, so I'm going to ask a question that I want to ask all the panelists,
Sure.
but I'm going to ask it to you first,
okay,
so that we make sure a chance to. So I've been at Radio Boston for 3 months now, and we've covered a broad range of issues, everything from my very first day was the Red Line T derailment, right? So transportation, EEE, housing, community violence, opioid crisis. Over and over again, what we hear is we need regional coordination. We need a regional solution. We need regional commitment. We need a regional plan. And it rings very clear tonight that we're saying that again. So what are a couple of practical key steps that we can actually do that will begin to improve regional coordination and planning on the question of housing?
It is a regional question, but when I said housing dies on the vine on a local level, that rings true. We need to work regionally, but we need to think locally, right? And that means it goes to town halls. We need to encourage, we need to build in the technical capacities of local administrators, the residents there to understand what density means, what is affordable housing with a capital A and a lowercase a, right? And that's why it's important. We can think and plan regionally, but to actually get production to occur, we actually need to work on a local level. And that's why we're providing TA assistance, the housing choice legislation that we're encouraging at this moment. It also comes with grants to increase, and also technical assistance to the local levels. And so that's where I really think the attention needs to be on.
Sheila, you were nodding both while I asked the question and as Janelle was answering, so let me turn to you next.
So the MAPC, Metropolitan Area Planning Council, pulled together the 15 cities and towns that surround Boston. And they did a lot of wonderful research on the population and how many housing units do we need? And they came up, we all agreed to a number of 185,000. 185,000 housing units would meet our housing needs and meet the growing population. Boston has said, okay, we're into this for 69,000. We've permitted 29,000, and we track every income band, like exactly how affordable is that unit or not. We are the only city in town of the 15 that came together that have put forth a numerical goal. Cambridge, I think, just recently has. So, and maybe Somerville, but I think Cambridge is the only one. What we need right now is we need leadership. We need leadership at the city and town level. They need to come forward. They need to make the case that housing is really important. It's good for our economy. It's good for their families. It's good for their elders. And we need leadership from cities and towns. 185,000 was really easy. Everybody got up on a stage. I remember the day well. I think we were all there. It was a great day, 185. Now most cities and towns aren't saying what they're going to contribute. So we need leadership, and we needed it yesterday.
Amy, Roger, Amy, go ahead.
Yeah, so I 100% agree. More dialogue and conversation in the communities outside of Somerville, Cambridge, Boston that are already taking action. I had a very specific idea, though, that plays into what Sheila was just saying. There's an organization called the Boston Area Research Initiative, and last year's spring that's very focused on data and use of data to enable and aid the city in particular. And the theme of our spring conference in April was all about sort of cross-border collaboration, regional collaboration, and how do we share data across. Of course, two of the big issues that we talked about are housing and transportation, because those are very much, but all of the issues that you mentioned are things that I think we can address regionally. And it sounds like from the start, you started with a data conversation. And so I do think that to some extent, data can be a convening force, that we can start looking at things regionally and comparatively across communities and help bring those communities together.
Roger,
The tool is MHP. They have a data town, which is a wonderful tool where it tells folks how many building permits are being pulled, lets folks understand their own community. Is it an Asian community? Are you a millennial valley? And helps with planning, right? And so that's part of the educational piece that can help local cities and towns.
Okay, so shall I move on to my next question, or do you have something? Okay, so one of the organizations I ran, we had this concept called the stupid rule. All right, so, and here's how the stupid rule worked. Every once in a while, we'd be trying to get something done, and we would realize that the reason we couldn't is because there was some stupid rule, probably self-imposed, that was in the way. And we would try to identify stupid rules and take the steps to eliminate the stupid rules. Are there, Roger, I'll start with you since I haven't asked you a question yet. What are the stupid rules that you would love to see? One stupid rule you'd love to see targeted.
Where do I start? Well, let me just give you a little anecdote. Sheila. Oh, no. Close your ears. No, you're not in that alone. We are in the middle of a transformation project in the city of Boston, 3 city blocks that used to be a public housing development. And with the help of our federal government, state and local, we are transforming that into a 3-block mixed income, mixed use community. We just closed the first phase last year. It's going to deliver at the end of this year 94 units. When we were doing the debrief with my team after that, it turned out that in the course of just building those 94 units that had plenty of community support, we could do the density, we had the money, we had 8 design reviews, right? Each entity that was involved had a different designer that had an idea, and we went through that 8 times. I think that's a little overkill. I mean, and we paid an architect a ton of money and engineers and all that. So if I could change one rule, for the purposes of this discussion, I'd love to have kind of consolidated design, engineering review, and then let my professionals do their job.
And I would say, by the way, that is an excellent example, right, of what I'm talking about. The other 3 of you, any stupid rules?
I have an example that my colleague in Seattle shared with me in Bellevue. So one of the things that we want to do through our efforts in Washington is engage in a policy conversation to try to use the weight of Microsoft to help address some of these rules that might not apply any longer.
Which is a much more genteel way of putting what I said.
So she shared an example about a project in Bellevue, which is a community kind of like Brookline or Newton is to Boston, that they're developing on a light rail station. She called them podments, which are micro efficiency units, and they are required to have one parking spot for every unit of housing. there are also fees that they pay for these parking spots. So they're struggling to make the project whole, and that's the difference. If they can save the money on the parking spots, they can produce the project, and it's good for everyone. So and I know there are similar examples in Boston and Massachusetts where there are older rules where if we're putting things on public transit, do we still have the same rules and guidelines for parking?
Sheila, what would you like to add?
So my stupid rule, that I started to correct myself, which I often do. But we have a whole city that cares about, as far as I can see, two things: politics and housing. It's all we talk about. But we got a lot of people that care deeply about housing. And the stupid rule to me is that we can't come together and figure out exactly what we need to do in a civilized, productive way. We fight about AMIs and who we're housing and who we're not housing, and we need housing across so many income groups and so many demographics that I find it very stupid that we're fighting amongst ourselves to be a purist about a particular type of housing.
Janelle, last word on this question.
So that's the easy one for us, and we already previewed it with Secretary Keneally's remarks about the stupid rule of two-thirds super majority to pass anything in regards to housing production, to make it a simple majority, to allow cities and towns to do the right thing. If they want to produce housing, let's allow them to do that. Let's take off those handcuffs at this moment. And so that's an easy super rule that we are trying to correct right now.
Excellent, thank you. Again, I understand that you're gonna have to leave us at some point. It's 7:00, so I thought I'd invite the audience to join me in thanking you for being a part of this. So I think we're turning now to the portion where we do some storytelling, and I think the Alliance is actually curating that piece where I just can't see you. So I think we're going to invite a few stories from the audience. People are going to tell us this is sort of the case example section of the evening, and I'll invite the panelists to respond to those stories, frankly, kind of Radio Boston style. So, hi, please introduce yourself, and you can share your story.
So my name is Emily Cantor, and I'm the CEO and co-owner of Cambridge Naturals. We're a 45-year-old health and wellness business, and we're committed to paying a fair wage. We raised our starting wage to $15 an hour a couple years ago, and we truly value our employees, who are really essential to our business model. But that only goes so far, obviously, when housing is so expensive in and around our stores. My husband and I couldn't afford to buy a home in Cambridge, where I grew up. And one of our key employees was forced to move farther away when his rent essentially doubled overnight. So how can small brick and mortar companies find and retain talent if their employees can't live in the area?
And remind me your first name again.
My name is Emily.
Okay. First, just initial reactions to Emily's question. Roger, you looked like you wanted to jump in on that.
Thank you. That's so painful. I mean, I'll just say, we're, like I said, we're building housing in the city of Boston now, and I had one of my staff people do a theoretical run on a larger building that we're building, hopefully to do a lot of density at a transit station. And when we did the rent that was required to just pay for construction costs, not any profit, we're a nonprofit, the break-even rent was $4,000 a month for a two-bedroom apartment. That's just the cost. And we had free land.
I'm sorry, the land was free.
The land was free.
And to cover costs, why? Can you dig into that just a little bit for us? Why?
Well, because in Boston, in that particular location, because it's high visibility, and we're doing a tall building, which will be steel, and will likely have 100% union participation, my costs per square foot is north of $450 a square foot.
In construction cost.
In construction cost alone.
So the way that I'm looking at this these days is that we are trying to build as much affordable housing as we can. Now, if your employee was living in Cambridge, they would 70% of the new affordable housing that's coming online in Boston, we're going to give to Boston residents. So Cambridge might have similar rules. So we need to continue to build as much affordable housing as we can across a range of incomes. But I also think that we need the private market to do other. And I'm encouraged that you're viewing some innovative stuff in DC. We need small. I mean, there's a new develop. I just met a couple of days ago with a developer from the UK, and they build these beautiful units with a lot of natural light. And they're just a little over 200 square feet, but they're magnificent, and they're renting for about $1,800 a month, and they want to come here. There's another person from the UK, and they build these what do they call them? But anyways, they build these very, very, very small home ownership opportunities that are 400 square feet, and they just stack them up. But I do think developers need to do something other than we're going to build rental housing and start at $5 a square foot. So I don't think any of us in sort of using public subsidy is going to solve it. We should continue to build, keep our pipeline strong, add. 20% of Boston's housing stock is deed restricted affordable, and to a range of incomes, and we'll continue to do that. And I'd like to break that 20%. I'd like it 25 or even higher. But the market has got to get more creative. We're not going to be able to solve it on our own.
So, Amy, in a second, I'm going to invite you to add in. But Sheila, and if you don't know this off the top of your head, you'd kind of be a superhero if you did. But I'm going to ask in case you do. What are those brackets around area median income? Can you?
Sure, and I should have brought them, but generally, when we build affordable housing, we're setting aside, we fund affordable housing, we get money from the state, we get money from the feds, and we give free land, and then we have a range of incomes. We set aside 10% of the affordable housing, it's deed restricted, for folks that are homeless, and usually there's project-based subsidies. So usually you don't have to make anything up to probably, $15,000 a year. So there's a set aside for very low income, homeless individuals and families. And then the rest is tax credits, sort of tax credit funded. And Roger, I'm going to say that, depending on household size, it's usually folks households that are making like sort of less than $50,000 generally. I mean, there's nuances. Middle income, you're making 50, 60, 70, and then there's the market. I mean, but it all depends on family size and household size and your funding source. But it does get ridiculously complicated. But a lot of what Boston has is public housing or housing that was built a while ago where they actually attach subsidies to the units, and then it doesn't matter what your income is. You get there and you pay 30% of whatever your income is. So if your income is zero, you're paying zero. If your income is, $100, you're paying 30. So we have quite a lot of that housing in Boston, but not enough. And those are programs the federal government no longer funds. So we need to bring those back so we can really serve very low income populations.
And now, Amy, obviously Microsoft is probably at a different scale than Emily's business. But that being said, how can companies think about supporting their employees in livability and affordability in the communities in which those businesses exist?
Yeah, I'll start with the positive, and then I'm going to pile on a little bit because I have some stories that I collected from my colleagues. I think the dialogue and promoting the dialogue to help encourage a broad cross-section of people to consider how important this is to our community, to the whole city. But I think that, for example, at Microsoft, there's work that can be done across the employee base to really have a conversation. Most of the employees at Microsoft can afford to live in Cambridge or in the surrounding communities if they choose to do so. But so how do we help them to sort of understand the whole story that we've been talking about here? But I can also share some stories from our employees, some of our very high potential employees who've moved out of state because they can. So we provide a really fluid and flexible work environment where a lot of people can work remotely. So I got a couple of stories. Someone who recently chose to move to Utah. And he's working for a team that's based here in Cambridge, but he lives in Utah and he commutes here when he needs to. Another leader, we recently expanded one of our engineering teams that's based here in Cambridge, and we now have a second site in Houston, and he's likely going to move to Houston, and a lot of it has to do with the cost of housing. And another interesting a software engineer who was curious to learn more about remote work options, citing the cost of living in and around Boston is so expensive, and he's single. He doesn't have a family yet, and still wants to buy a house, though, and is looking at what remote options there are.
Emily, Roger, go ahead.
I was just going to say, Just to get back to your point, you could encourage your employees to be involved in their local communities. I mean, we're working in a project in Somerville now where, with the help of community, we've increased the density of a 216-unit development to about 500 units, and we could not have done that unless the abutters and the community supported that kind of increase in density for exactly the reason that you pointed out.
Any last follow-up comments or questions, Emily, before we take another story?
I thank you for your feedback, and I really appreciate the stories in Microsoft. Although it is very different for us. We're brick and mortar, and our employees can't work remotely, unfortunately, most of them. So we're really looking for solutions where they can get to work very easily and quickly. And I think the key here is also transportation.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like regional transportation was the piece of that puzzle that. All right, do we have another story?
Hi, my name's Anmol Mehra. I'm the board chair of Urbanity Dance. We're a contemporary dance company in the South End, and wanted to talk just for a minute about kind of the creative class and the artists in Boston. If we think of what makes Boston wonderful, you mentioned about we're first in everything, or in a lot of things. When I think of Boston, I think of the MFA or Paradise Rock Club down the street, or Make Way for Ducklings, or Boston Pop, so many things, yet increasingly those who create and perform and inspire in the city of Boston can't live in the city that they're making wonderful. And I think that's really a shame. We had a performance a couple years ago at the Sci Center just around the corner from here, and at the end of the show, some of us wanted to go check out the MFA late nights, and two of the dancers really wanted to go, but they had to take the last train back to the South Coast and to Central Mass because they had to go sleep for a few hours to come back to go teach. And so there's obviously, income and there's transportation, a lot of stuff involved in this. One of the dancers who lived like somewhere between Worcester and Springfield, who drove in 2 hours every day, came to me earlier. She's gotten some more responsibilities with us and was able to move to Worcester. And she's excited that her commute's only an hour and 15 minutes every day. And it's a shame. And one of the things she brought up was that, look, Anmol, like I can make rent. I'll hustle, I'll waitress, I'll do whatever, but I can't pay first, last, security, and broker. That's 4 months. And then she also has last and security at her last place. And so I don't really care what career you're in, and all of us in our mid-20s, very few people can float 6 months rent.
All right, thank you. And it's Amel, is that right?
Yes.
Okay. So Sheila, let's start with you.
So I just want to mention a couple of things that we're trying, but also maybe a potential deficit. So, and I didn't bring this number with me, but I can certainly follow up. We have been trying to increase the amount of artist housing we have, both workspace and live workspace. And we do have you have to get certified in the city, but it does work. It does turn over, but we need to bring on more. And recently, the city put out some land on Condor Street in East Boston, kind of a really gritty, nice street. And then we've got some stuff on Terrace Street, so we put it out for live work. And what's interesting about artist live work is that before, when we developed live work, like every unit was the size of this, this theater. And now, because people are, working off computers, you need some large space, some of it's smaller, some of it's performance. So it has evolved and changed. What Boston doesn't have, and other cities do, they don't have a nonprofit that wakes up every single day thinking about how they're going to create this space. There are some nonprofits that dabble in it, but there's not like Chicago has a group, and the name escapes me. They wake up every single day and they try to it's a nonprofit, and they try to add to the space. And so I would welcome any type of organization like that to work with. We put this land out, by hook or by crook, we get a developer to do it, but we're not in partnership with space makers. So I think it's a deficit that Boston has, and as things get more and more expensive, I'm working with a group in Dorchester right now, and the building's for sale, and Humphrey Street, and there's bit by bit, unless we've already bought, already developed, and deed restricted, those spaces are going to get lost and get lost forever. So I would welcome the help on this. We'll fund good projects, but we don't have the good projects coming in to us.
Roger, was there any part of that resonated? You've heard it before, you've heard it elsewhere in the urbanity story?
Well, I have a slightly different take in that, from our perspective, we work in some neighborhoods that we're trying to help stabilize. And in many places, having artists participate and having artists live workspaces, performance spaces, gallery spaces is part of the transformation. It's very powerful. In fact, we're looking at an opportunity perhaps in a neighborhood in Boston where we might be able to deploy that. So, but that design, but we'll bring our own artists, and so they can do their own design review. Thank you very much. But we'd love to do that because we think it's very important to complete a neighborhood, and not just have a place to live, but make it part of the fabric of the place, part of our placemaking activity.
Amy, go ahead.
Yeah, and I think that's the motivation of a lot of the work that we're doing in Washington is that we want the whole community to be able to live in the community, not just the people that are working at Microsoft.
It does seem, so to any of the three of you, it does seem like this idea of this bolus of money, the cash piece that you have to have for first, last security broker, that this is a problem that a variety of financial institutions, lending circles, co-ops, et cetera, have solved in other places for other purposes. What could be done now to try to help solve that kind of problem to improve people's mobility?
We have pools of this type of money for people that are homeless, that are moving into units. We certainly come up with first and last. We come up with, there's a great state-funded program called RAFT. So if you find yourself and you have to move and you're going to be evicted, there's this flexible money that we often use it for first, last. But what there isn't is the person who's not in a crisis, but just needs to move. So it seems like there is a gap in services, and I certainly acknowledge that. So we need to give that some thought. So if you're in crisis and you're very poor, those resources exist, but they may not exist for the more general public.
Anything either of you would like to add before we go to our next story? Any last follow-up questions or comments?
Yeah.
I know I keep doing this before you guys get the mic back. Sorry about that.
Yeah, I'll say, Sheila, thank you. I know the city of Boston does do a lot. I have several friends who have owned their own places, and it really is transformational for them. Just two comments on that. One is that there's a very narrow line that they need to thread. They have to make enough money to be able to make the down payment, but they can't make too much money. And so that's something that has been challenging for some friends of mine to go through that process. One who even had to give up a raise in order to kind of qualify. And so, and the second thing is that you are, it's primarily, my understanding, it's primarily owned properties. There's very little, if anything, for rentals. And for the number of people that come here for conservatory or come here for a fresh start in whatever their career is, it's really difficult in and of itself generally, even more so for artists who may not have traditional W-2 income.
Go ahead, Sheila.
The projects, the one in East Boston is rental, not home ownership. There is a general opinion among artists have this, I do not, that rental artist housing, the artists are more productive than it's ridiculous than home for sale artist housing, because there's more churn, and the churn equals creativity, et cetera. I don't know. I think we need it all, but.
All right, well, I think we had one more story here, and then we'll move to or are you a story as well? Okay, so we have two more. This gentleman here in the middle first, pardon me for pointing. Megan, were you going to say something back there?
Yeah, we're done with stories, but we can take one if you want.
All right.
And then we have to move on to Q&A.
Well, so here's what we'll do. I've already committed to this gentleman here in the middle, so I'm going to stick to that commitment. And then, Slido takes questions that are in the form of stories, as well as in the form of questions. If you can type, you can put it up there, and we can put it into the Q&A. Please, one more.
All right, thank you guys for allowing me to kind of share my story. I just recently moved here from Florida, from Tampa, 6 months ago. And what attracted me to Boston is I got a great job at Bank of New York Mellon in the finance industry. I worked for the wealth management team, and those opportunities weren't down in Tampa. But what was available was the opportunity to invest in the housing market. A big portion of the population down there will not only buy a home, but buy a rental property. So they're able to expand and fix and flip and use hard money to explore these different housing investment opportunities. And when I came to Boston, there's no houses below $500,000. So it prices me out of the market. And not only that, but there was an investment opportunity with Airbnb. I plan to move here, get a roommate, rent out the other room, and now I can cover my expenses and I can be an entrepreneur. And it seems like the city's kind of pushing that away in order to allow different types of housing. So as a young real estate investor from Florida who just moved up here, who's trying to stay and who's trying to get into the market, what can I do? What are some options? How can I get involved in the housing market?
Okay, thank you for that. And I'm sorry, I need your name, please.
Christian.
Thanks, Christian. All right, so our last story before we move to Q&A. Christian story, Sheila, why don't we start with you?
You're right. It's really expensive. So I think there are really some wonderful neighborhoods where you can buy a home for less than $500,000. It may not be downtown, but there really are some fabulous Boston neighborhoods. The Airbnb, if I could just respond to that. So we have through ordinance, and I'm not an attorney, but we have eliminated Airbnb or hosts being allowed to rent whole units on Airbnb, unless it's a triple decker and it's adjacent to, we tried not to harm people that really needed the income to pay for their triple decker, but the investor-owned Airbnb units downtown, as of September 1, they had to cease and desist. And we just recently negotiated with Airbnb, so they're going to start sharing that information. That's so important. I mean, we're saying to Boston, we need to build a lot of new housing. It's got to be dense. It's got to be near transit because we've got to ease our housing market. We've got to increase our vacancy. And then 15, 20% of new buildings were being used, the units in new buildings were being used for Airbnb. So it was great to have the tourists come and enjoy, and it really was taking away permanent housing stock. So I'm hoping that come September 1, it happened, didn't it? But soon, we're going to start seeing the vacancy rate start to expand some, and maybe starting to see some moderation of prices just because of supply coming back on the market. So it was tough. A lot of people didn't agree. We had tons and tons of internal conversations about this because Airbnb is such a great tool and everybody uses it to travel. But right now, given our housing situation, we actually need all of those units to house residents. So keep looking.
Amy, Roger, either of you want to add anything there? All right, so we're going to move to question and answer now, and I would encourage you to follow the instructions on the screen to submit your questions through Slido. We have plenty of time for Q&A. I think, yeah, please, Secretary, yes.
More of a point than a question, but I'm going to go as well. But I think it's easy in this discussion. I'm going to have to leave shortly, but I'll just make one quick point. But as we talk about this, I think it's easy to talk about this as a housing problem in Boston. It's a housing problem in Massachusetts. And Boston is absolutely leading on this. What we really need in Massachusetts is a lot more multifamily housing near public transit and in downtowns. If you look at all the multifamily housing produced in Massachusetts the last 5 years, over 40% is in Boston. And Roger had the example of it's hard to permit some of this stuff in small towns. We need that. We need a lot more communities to produce a lot more multifamily housing, hence the need for the governor's housing choice bill to lower the threshold to approve it. But the city of Boston ought to be commended for their leadership on the issue.
Thank you.
You got it. All right.
All right, sorry, go ahead. Okay. All right, let's go to some questions. All right, one of the questions, I'm sorry, I'm having a little asthma, I'm going to cough. No, I'm fine, thanks. One of the questions is, lack of affordable housing is also creating gentrification and displacement in our city. What can we do to protect and preserve diversity along with the housing stock? Honestly, you look like you want to and you're not sure.
Well, there's a couple of different dynamics that I've run into, but the short answer is produce. We need production. And in other communities that I've worked with, sometimes I run into a community attitude that says, we don't want development in our neighborhood because we don't want gentrification or we don't want people to look like us. But the fact is, if you don't produce and the population's increasing, the cost of the resource goes up, and then you get forced out by the dynamics in the marketplace. So to the extent that we can cooperate with the city and the feds and the state to do more production, we can hopefully, keep having diverse communities. I know we're very intentional about that with the work that we do, and the resources that we garner from the city and the state help us create that kind of what we are trying to do, a very healthy community. But what we can't do, and what I see too often in my other life of a zoning board member, is keep everybody out.
Anybody want to add to that, Amy?
Well, I think increasing housing stock and actually diversifying housing options in the suburbs immediately around Boston also will help increase the diversity of the entire region.
I just want to add that I acknowledge that it's taking place in Boston, and it's really distressing to see. What I can't do anything about but what we can't do anything about is people can sell their homes for a whole lot of money, and they do, and they leave. And sometimes, and then people say, we can't buy in the neighborhood. And it's like people are just selling. And I get it's their retirement. It's how, what. But what we can do is continue to build affordable housing in every neighborhood in the city. And there are some neighborhoods that I worry about, not more than others, but I worry a whole lot about, just because of how important they are to the city culturally. Chinatown. Dudley and Roxbury. Places like that where it's just the culture is so rich. Now, in those areas, in Roxbury, 45% of the housing stock is deed restricted affordable. But people are very, very, very worried about losing it. So we need to continue to add. But when you think about it, 45% of the stock in Roxbury. In Chinatown, it's about 40 on a good day. It's about high 30s. So there is a lot of affordable housing in some of these neighborhoods we all worry about, but we need to just create more and more. Now, we cannot give preference. So if we build affordable housing in Chinatown, we can't say that Chinatown residents, we can't, because of fair housing, we can't say Chinatown residents can get those units. They may know of the of it coming online, so there may be larger numbers of those folks in the lottery, but we can't set aside units. What the state is going to allow us to do soon, though, is to give preference for the affordable housing units coming online if people can show that they are low income, the right income, whatever the income band is, and paying more than 50% of their income in rent, and really housing, their housing costs are creating burden. So we might be able to get people to stay that way. So anyways, I'm babbling, it's complicated.
So I just realized I'm looking at the questions here. You're seeing them up on the screen. One of the secrets of how we produce a show like mine, like Radio Boston, is the production team gives me a list of questions. I get to ask whichever one I want in whatever order I want, or a different one if I'd rather ask something else. So I do not feel beholden to go in order of what's on the screen behind me. I have no intention of doing so. So if you see me not ask the next question on the screen, sorry. But I find that it makes a better discussion. So one that I'd like, it actually probably is on the screen behind us, is are there places, and I think this is funny, other than the Netherlands, they say, places closer to home that are doing this right, and whom we should be emulating, we should be formulating responses based on their good example. Amy, I'm going to turn to you first because you work for a global company that may have seen these examples. I'm also sort of putting you on the spot, but does that question resonate with you, and are there other places closer than the Netherlands that are doing this right?
I guess I'm going to cheat a little, and I think that the surrounding suburbs need to take a look at Boston and figure out and start to make some more commitments to how they can diversify housing.
It's actually a very interesting reframing, because we tend to, the problem is Boston. But I feel like consistently what we're hearing tonight is, in fact, the problem is the outlying communities who don't have a sense of solidarity and shared experience with this challenge.
Well, and I think there's even a misconception that adding diversified housing might affect people's housing costs in some of the wealthier suburbs in particular. And I think that this is where I think the dialogue comes in, and I think it's important to try to socialize, explain I learned a lot from the ABL housing boot camp that I went to a couple of years ago, and just sort of explain that this is good for everyone, and that it's not going to affect your individual home value and things like that.
Either of you want to add?
I'll just add that I think that the United States has got it. We've really done a dismal job at prioritizing housing resources. for the last, 20 years. And I'm very, very hopeful that in this new presidential election and watching the folks in the primary, they are talking about housing more than they ever have. And housing professionals are pushing this and are pushing it a lot. But we really do need to continue to ask the question for anyone who wants to be president of the United States, how are you going to make housing a top priority again in this country? We extract from developers and we're using, hotel tax and this. And we really are cobbling together, lots of resources every year, but it's a drop in the bucket for what we need, and we need the feds to get back in the business of creating housing. So we're not doing a good job right now.
Okay. Another question, this one from, she just moved on my screen. There it is, Molly Goodman. Older generations often consider single-family homes the American dream. It just moved on my screen again. There it is. But condos are more realistic as starter homes. How do we shift public perception in that direction?
Roger. Spend a day on the turnpike trying to get into Boston. Right? No, I'm not. I'm kind of not kidding.
I kind of sensed that you weren't.
10 years ago or 15 years ago, you could start 20 miles outside of Boston and you could get in the city in 45 minutes if you had a job. That trip now is an hour and a half. And that reality, when you 3 hours a day, 15 hours a week, and how many hours a year that is, I think people's priorities will change. For example, I would love to move back into the city and not face that drive, except it's very expensive because there's not a lot of product that's being built at a price point that I can live in. But if we get more density in key places, that will happen.
There are a couple of questions on the board. I'm sorry that we don't have either Janelle or the secretary, because I think this is at some level a statewide question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. There are a couple of questions on the board that, if we boiled them down, would be, why can't we cap rent?
So I just want to answer the question about this new. I think we need a new generation of starter homes, and I don't know what that means. But I'd love to, anyone who's out there that wants to think that through with me and others, we need to get the BSA, Boston Society of Architects, involved with that. And I keep saying to my staff, what's the new starter home? But I think we really do need to think about it. It doesn't seem to be, maybe it's a condo, but maybe it's a condo plus, but I think we do need to think about a new starter home. I'm sorry, I just had to. So I'd love if anyone's got any ideas on that to see me afterwards.
There's an urban designer out of, I want to say, North Carolina, a woman named Winona Satcher, who has been celebrated and funded a lot for experimenting with starter residences that are storage containers and that are mobile and move from place to place. And it's interesting because it's raised questions of the viability of that, but also what do we want in the dignity of our housing and the kind of the comfort and the style of the physical space. So Roger, I'm freestyling. I know I'm supposed to stick to the stuff on that, but it made me think of that. And I do want to ask, as we think about solving housing problems, what are the central organizing principles of quality of housing, dignity of housing, that we need to keep front and center across the range of public policy solutions we might pursue? And I picked you first because I was looking at you, but I would welcome any of the three of you to dive in on that question.
At a bare minimum? Yeah. Is that your question?
Well, no, I don't want to just minimize it, but what is that set of values, rules, sort of conditions that we want to make sure we keep in place?
Well, safe and secure and affordable is the easy answer, but internally, as we're thinking about it, particularly given our adventures in the Netherlands, one of the things that we're thinking about, I was talking about that today, is whether our concept of what a house is or appropriate housing is too fancy. Maybe it's too encompassing. Maybe we should think more simply about what we're doing. I mean, the folks that reported back to me from the trip to the Netherlands was like, well, yeah, they build a lot of houses, but they're smaller than what we're used to. They use inferior products, but hey, it's got a 10-year life. maybe we should just live with a 10-year life, but at least we can put a roof over the head instead of, what's my 40-year life? And, I'm thinking about holding this asset for 40 years, but in the course of doing that, I'm driving up the cost by 200%. Maybe I do a simpler box. And maybe it's smaller. Maybe it's 200 square feet instead of 395. Or I was in Copenhagen last year, and I had a perfectly nice 3-bedroom apartment. It was less than 1,000 square feet with 1 bedroom. If I were building that in the city of Boston, I couldn't build that unit.
Who else would like to add?
And I think it's interesting to think like what the Housing Innovation Lab in the city did last year. Was it just last year, where they actually had some of those micro units on display for people to walk through. I think we do have a very traditional, especially in Massachusetts, a very traditional idea of what housing should look like, and so many other cities, as mentioned in the Netherlands and other parts of the world, are trying out these different models. And so, how do we give residents a chance to physically experience some of that, so that we can get feedback, we can collect data, so that it creates a business case for the developers to pursue it.
So here's another question right from the top of the list. Is the business community willing to pursue bold policy ideas, such as rent control and zoning reform, in addition to the housing choice build? Do we think that appetite is out there? Sheila?
So there's a lot of talk about rent control these days. Maybe because the state of California just passed rent control. I don't know if the governor signed it yet, right? The legislature just passed it. I'm looking at CHAPA. And Oregon just passed state rent control, and most major cities have rent control. For folks that don't follow rent control here in Boston, we lost rent control in 1993, 4, 5. It was a statewide ballot question. So the state decided that Brookline, Cambridge, and Boston no longer should have rent control. It's kind of amazing that the state was decided our fate. So we would have to have the state agree to pass some form of rent control, either a ballot question, I think, or just through the state legislature. I'm looking at CHAPA. So so I think we've tried sort of over the years to think about how to provide better tenant protections and not go to the rent control question because we didn't feel like the state had the will. And I'm not speaking from the Mayor Walsh right now. I'm just speaking for the history of rent control. But I do think it's being talked about more and more and more, especially when you look at now. Oregon and California had they passed something that's fairly similar. I think California was 5% plus CPI or 4% plus CPI, but it was a fairly big increase. I mean, it was going to allow owners to go up, by 8 or 9% per year. So that's a good increase, but it wasn't going to allow them to go to 20 or 30%. So I think it's starting to percolate, and I think people are starting to talk about it, the pros and cons, and I think we're going to hear more and more about rent control statewide in the upcoming months. We did file a couple of pieces of legislation that we're trying really hard to get passed this year. It's really hard to get stuff passed at the state. I think there's a general perception that if Boston wants to do something, we can just do it. We're incredibly limited in what the state allows us to do, which is it's kind of a hard concept and people don't know that, but we can't enact rent control. So we did file a bill that would say, hey, for those really older people living in units, you can't raise their rents by more than 5% per year. And if you're going to evict them, you have to have a really good reason. It's getting no traction at the State House. It's like, come on. And now we are working with a fairly good coalition on any poor person, low-income person, going into housing court facing eviction would have to have a public defender if they wanted one. Common sense. That is not going to be easy to pass. So it's like it's mind-boggling to me. We're in Massachusetts and getting these fairly modest protections for tenants is really hard to do. So I guess I'll leave. I'm not on the defensive at all. It's just Boston would like to have some of these protections in place. It's really hard to get this stuff passed at the state.
Let's pick up a question from Cindy Rowe. And Cindy, if I pronounced your last name wrong, I apologize. How do we overcome the opposition to density and affordable housing in suburban communities, especially given the impact of racial prejudice on these decisions?
one step at a time. I mean, in the town I live in, the big step was moving, and just within the last year, they passed a town meeting zoning bylaw that now allows accessory dwelling units that don't have to be occupied by.
Can you define that term, accessory dwelling unit?
Well, if you've got our town has 1, 2, 3, 4 acre zoning with single family houses on it, and there was a prohibition against having another dwelling unit in your house unless the person was a relative or a housekeeper. So the big step for that town, for our town, was to realize that, hey, maybe that's a little bit restrictive, and so
Maybe
you
the
laugh.
Housekeeper thing is from a different time.
But the big step was saying, okay, now we can do accessory dwelling units where you can rent them out to anybody, and part of that, people giggle but that was a big step for a lot of people.
So, Roger, what was the resistance to that in that community? I mean, that just happened. I think you said last year.
Yeah, this year.
This year. So what was the resistance?
People don't want rental housing at all. Did not want rental housing at all. And a lot of that was, the code words. Kids, right? We don't want to burden our schools. We don't want people to live in our community that might bring down our property values. There's a really cute term. Rural character. Giggling in the crowd, but it's true. And so getting beyond that as generations change, as people realize that those policies actually prevent their kids from living in the place where they grew up. There's no place for you to live unless you want to live in your parents' basement forever. So gradually, that's changing.
Amy, I saw you nodding.
Yeah, so I also live in a community that's struggling to add more diversified housing. And I guess 2 years ago, Sasaki and Associates did some community gatherings. I guess there were more like workshops, and they also showed up to a lot of the town events and stuff. It sounds kind of simple, but to try to bring people along, that this isn't... that it's not going to affect your housing value, that just that adding, and in fact they are building 2 buildings of apartments and condos, sort of, and so it's not all affordable at all, but it's diverse in the housing stock. It's adding some diversity of housing stock on public transit and things like that. And I think in the community it was kind of a combination of the mayor kind of forcing it through, and at the same time working with Sasaki to try to do some of these workshops to encourage to start that dialogue again.
I'm going to put 2 questions together here. One is, how can we mobilize business leaders to advocate for? I lost it. Sorry. How can we there it is. How can we mobilize business leaders to advocate for housing production and affordability in their home communities? And alongside that, we hear business leaders talk about transportation, utilities, and healthcare. How do we get affordable housing to be a top-tier issue for business leaders? So how do we create urgency for business leaders, and then how do we get them to turn that urgency into advocacy in their home communities? And I welcome any of the 3 of you. Maybe I'll start with you, Amy, since you're our business representative on the
Yeah, I mean, in my mind, they're all connected. And so, right, we've talked about transportation a lot and all of those issues. And so the more that we can draw those connections between housing and transportation, that it's not just that all of these things are interconnected. So to help business leaders understand that we're not just advocating for one thing, but that these things, it's a holistic conversation, and it's for the whole of the community. In terms of getting people engaged, some of the thing we talked a little bit earlier about, I think just trying to have the conversation. I know. For example, within Microsoft, we have about 1,000 employees in Massachusetts, and I'd venture to guess that very few of them have spent a ton of time really thinking about housing, except when they have to buy a house. And sure, everyone complains about the cost of housing, or they end up commuting longer. But I don't think they're thinking about sort of it holistically as a community and where their teachers are living and where the service people are living or the firemen and police officers and things like that they're not living within their community because they can't afford it. And so there's an education opportunity, I think, within the employee space at companies like Microsoft and other companies in the Boston area.
I would add that businesses, especially when they band together, they're a very, very powerful lobby, as we all know, right? They're a very powerful voice, and I know that they are talking more and more about transportation in Massachusetts and what we need to do to improve it. I would also ask that maybe they stop they're being so interested in tax cuts and pay a little bit more in taxes and say to the federal government, let's invest in affordable housing because our employees can't, live and based on their wages. So, I think they can lobby for additional housing, but we really do need resources. So let's have them pay more in taxes, and we can build more housing, and we can improve our transportation.
Roger, anything you'd want to add?
Just that I don't think we should lose track of the fact that Boston is a very, very attractive place. Cambridge is attractive for businesses. We're exploring an opportunity now where a business is wanting to expand here, and as part of their toll for expanding, the locality, the jurisdiction where they want to locate is forcing them to create housing and create affordable housing. They don't necessarily know how to do that, so we're engaged in a conversation with them about how we might help them do that. But they want to be here, they want their people to be here, and maybe our political leaders and civic leaders could engage the business leaders in that conversation and extract something in exchange for the privilege of doing business in Boston.
Let's ask another question. What about basing local and state resources on localities providing and enabling production of affordable housing? So I think that's a pitch, and again, this is probably a state level question. Sheila's loving it, if you hadn't noticed. What is the viability and practicality and what's the word I'm looking for? Wisdom of a proposal such as tie state aid, for example, to cities and towns based on their commitment to and production of affordable housing?
I think it's a brilliant idea, and I think it's been tried a couple of times. In derivation, I'm thinking of the CPA, right, where the state will chip in for affordable housing.
This being Community Preservation Act in this case.
That's right. And in some communities it works. You were doing it in Boston. In other communities, they're, keep your money, thank you very much, we like the way we are. But it's better than nothing.
I find this question kind of tricky, and I've heard it before, because you never want to say, well, hold back state aid from a town because people need there's elderly people living there and kids that need to go to school and all of that. But I'm glad Roger raised CPA. So Community Preservation Act, we take a surcharge off everybody's property taxes, and we put it in a fund, and we can use it on affordable housing, open space, or historic preservation. So a lot of the cities and towns that are using CPA are using it primarily for open space. So they're buying more and more land and doing open space development in more parks. And so we're getting maybe less affordable housing in neighborhoods and CPA really was created to build more affordable housing. So maybe it's there. Maybe we start making some requirements around CPA that some of these sources that are that the state allows you to collect. Maybe it's a higher percentage that needs to be used for affordable housing. But I'm always very wary about holding back state aid for cities and towns that aren't performing.
Okay, so go ahead and add, and then
I was just going to say, to kind of flip it a little bit, in the smaller cities and towns around Boston that have school systems and they treasure their school systems, it costs a ton of money. And the way we finance schools in Massachusetts is local property tax. So if there were a way to offer some relief for some cities and towns off of that onerous tax bill, more state assistance for their school systems, then maybe the homeowners would feel a little more receptive to something because they were going to get something out of it, and their schools would get the same or more funding.
So here's what we're going to do. We only have a little bit of time left, and I want the three of you to have a chance for closing remarks. What I'm going to do is I'm going to pull 3 questions from here. I'm going to paraphrase each one, and I'm going to do a rapid fire, meaning Amy, I'm going to give you one of them. Sheila, I'm going to give you one of them. Roger, I'm going to give you one of them, and we'll try to do sort of a tight question, tight answer, and then we can move to closing remarks from there. So Amy, to paraphrase, the question for you is, should businesses be in partnership with states and localities to also work on raising wages, to work on the ability to pay side, as well as the affordability of the property or rental unit side?
Yes. I mean, of course, I think that, I think that one of the strengths of the business community is sort of the ability to innovate and think creatively about other solutions that may help to solve the underlying problem. And so I think to the extent that we can address it from different angles, I think the business community absolutely should be part of that.
Okay, Sheila, this one I'm going to read it verbatim because it's a technical question. My grandmother received notification that the Affordable Housing Covenant is expiring and she needs to move out to allow market condos. What can she do?
Where is she moving out?
I don't know where she's. Are you asking what community is she in?
She's moving out to.
To allow market condos to come in. What can she do?
Ooh, so I need to know more, and I'm here. So if anyone wants to come up to me afterwards. So Boston right now has about 55,000 units of affordable housing. So not only do we need to create more, we always need to be looking, in our rearview mirror to make sure that developers are going to re-up their affordability when the term comes to an end. And we've had mostly success doing that. I gotta say, at Boston, if you're in other cities and towns, if your city and town is investing in affordable housing, they should invest in it in perpetuity. So if you want $10, you're keeping that unit available and affordable in perpetuity. So always ask that question. But the earlier deals didn't do that. They were 30, 40-year terms. They come to an end. So there are protections. Oh, sorry. I'm sorry. There a screen. When I get nervous, there are protections. There's 40T protections at the state. So the person, even if they are the property is coming to the affordability is coming to an end, they do have 3 years, I believe, of protections. But and sometimes, hopefully, that 3 years is used to find another affordable opportunity. But if you are around and you want to talk about that, come see me afterwards. Okay, and Roger, what is the potential or advisability of using prefab and modular units in order to reduce production costs and speed up construction?
I think it's a great potential. We've got that going on in Somerville, and at least 3 projects now. We're looking at that execution. A part of it is the labor saving. We just, there's not enough people in the workforce to do the production that we need. So that's one way for us to drive down costs. And more importantly, it quickens the time that we can actually build. In one project we can save 9 to 12 months off of a 2.5-year schedule, and that's important. We can either get people back in their houses quickly, or the cost of capital, we can drive down because our construction loan will be shorter. So we think that's going to happen. I know that there are several businesses that are exploring that in Massachusetts, have implemented it. Any of you coming in on the pike have seen a couple of examples on that within the last 3 years, and I expect that trend to continue.
All right, I want to thank our audience for submitting some fantastic and thought-provoking questions that have allowed us to really explore this conversation in greater depth. I'm going to turn to our panelists now and invite them each to take just 1 minute to make a closing remark. And why don't we go in reverse order this time? I'll start with you, Amy, and move this way.
Thanks for having me. I think Microsoft is going to learn a lot from these investments that we're making in Washington. And I think that it's very much going to be a little bit of an experiment over the next couple of years to sort of see how a company like Microsoft can invest in a way that's beneficial to our company, but also beneficial to the community. And I will do everything I can to bring some of that investment dollar east to Boston as well. So
thank you. Sheila?
And Chloe, thanks for having me. I think it's a problem that we all just have to keep working on and be very intentional about. And like I said earlier, I think you've heard tonight, we really need a regional response, which is true, but we so much more need a federal response. So I'm asking all of you to get involved in presidential campaigns, and let's make sure that building affordable housing and federal resources becomes a priority again.
Roger.
Well, it's hard to add to that, other than I think in Massachusetts, we're really blessed to have such enlightened public officials. We have some resources to bring to bear that other parts of the country don't really have. So as much as we have that housing crisis, we have a very rich ecosystem of really dedicated professionals, people like Sheila and some of the people in the audience. And if you put the money on the table, we can get it built.
I'd like to thank Secretary Janelle Chan and Secretary Keneally in absentia. They both had to leave. I hope you'll also join me in thanking the rest of our panelists for a really edifying. It's not an unenthusiastic clap. I'm just holding a microphone. Thank you to you for being engaged audience members. I hope. Did we roughly meet the learning agenda that we started with earlier tonight? I felt like we did. I felt like we hit the core issues. Thank you for coming. Thank you for participating. Thank you to the Alliance for hosting and for Boston Capital for sponsoring. Have a lovely evening.